This week we're going to try and explain what role impedance plays in the studio. We're going to look at signal types like instrument, mic, and line levels, and how impedance plays a role between your mic and your preamp and why it does or doesn't matter. It's a bit of a complex topic that's been mired in mystery and misinformation for decades. Hopefully we don't add to the confusion or present any misinformation. I'm going to combine some theory, math, and real-world examples and let you make up your mind if it's something that you need to worry about or if it's something that's just overthought and hyped up by manufacturers. Impedance can be described as a measurement of opposition to a current in a circuit when voltage is applied. What the hell does that mean? Before we go any further, let's take a few minutes to understand some basic electrical theory. After all, as an audio engineer, everything that we do revolves around electricity, and understanding the basic principles of it certainly couldn't hurt. Just ask that electroboom guy.
Outlet voltage.
Electricity travels in a circuit. That could be a small circuit like in a piece of audio equipment or a toaster, or something bigger like the power plant, transmission lines, and your house. A circuit is simply a path that electricity follows. A circuit contains a power source, a path, sometimes wires or the paths on a circuit board, and a ground or lower potential for the electricity to go towards. With nothing in the circuit, the electrons are free to move from the power source to the lower potential unimpeded. This would cause the circuit to get really hot from the electrons moving through it and potentially burn up. By adding a resistor or some resistive element, we can restrict or impede the flow of electrons from one place to another. In more complex circuits, resistors can help do a whole bunch of other things, but we're trying to keep this as simple as possible for now. The amount of electricity passing through a section of the circuit in a given time is measured in amperes or amps, and we refer to that measurement as amperage. The measurement of the electrical signal in respect to ground, or its opposite potential, is voltage, which is measured in volts. Volts can be positive or negative. We'll consider ground 0 volts, and if you're able to test the ground in your home or studio and it's not 0 volts, you might want to consult an electrician. In the studio, we have different devices that can be high or low impedance. Most electronic instruments are considered high impedance. Guitar pickups can be measured in the mega ohms range. High impedance devices tend to be limited by cable length. A guitar, for instance, can start to lose high end with cables exceeding 18 to 20 feet. A long cable can also drop the voltage, causing the signal that's hitting the amp to be lower than it should be. Many keyboards and synth modules will put out instrument level at its output, while others may offer line level output on unbalanced or balanced outputs. High impedance devices tend to use unbalanced cables, though that's not a hard and fast rule for most situations and tends to be true. We also say that these devices put out instrument level signal. Microphones, for the most part, tend to be low impedance and can be rated as low as 50 ohms depending on the mic. High-Z microphones do exist, and many vintage mics can be configured for high or low impedance operation. For instance, our RCA 74B can be wired multiple ways. Low impedance devices typically use balanced connections. Balanced cables allow for extremely long reach, or XLR. XLR cables can be run more than 200 feet in some instances, provided you have good quality cable. Microphones output what we call mic level signal. Some devices have line level output whose impedance can be anywhere from 100 to 600 ohms or more. Line level has the highest signal voltage of all three connection levels we talked about here. The line level input can be upwards of 10 kiloohms or more. This difference helps to drive the line signal. Line level signals can be found on both balanced and unbalanced connections. The use of balanced connections with line level equipment helps to reduce noise from device to device over long distances, but unbalanced cabling can be used as long as the runs remain short. This would be the connection between, say, an outboard mic pre and a compressor, or a preamp and an interface, or when using hardware inserts in your DAW, using the interface's line in and line out connections. So we've covered a lot of ground here already. We know about voltage, amperage, ohms, balanced and unbalanced connections, mic, instrument, and line levels. Now, let's take it back to how this is going to affect our mics and pre's. Many years ago, during the start of the telecom era, there was a belief that impedance levels needed to be matched between devices to get the best signal and power transmission. This gave birth to the 600 ohms standard, which can still be found in certain devices today. For really long runs, like miles or kilometers, that may be true, but turns out this really isn't applicable in the studio. For long runs, we're interested in power transmission between devices, which deals with voltage and amperage. In the studio, however, we don't care very much for the amperage aspect of the audio signal, but care more for the voltage level. After all, we don't convert amperage to sound, but we do convert voltage. In the case of dynamic microphones, which are both moving coil and ribbon mics, we tend to use a general rule of thumb of anywhere between 4 and 10 times the mic impedance to the preamp. So if a mic has an impedance of, say, 100 ohms, we would want a mic pre with an input impedance of at least 400 to 1000 ohms. Some older preamps, like a Neve 1073, can be set to 300 ohms or 1200 ohms. The argument is made that the 300 ohms in this case should sound slightly different than the 1200 ohm setting. Let's head over to the circuit simulator at falstad.com and try this out.
Okay, let's apply this theory now to something that we'll actually use in the studio. On the left here, we have a microphone with an AC signal and a pretty normal 150 ohm output impedance. Okay, and over here on the right, we have the input section of a microphone preamp. And there's a three-way switch here where we can select between 3 input impedances, 150 ohms, 1.2K, and 10 kilo ohms. When we start the simulation, we should be able to see what happens to the signal at each of these different settings. On the bottom here, we have 3 meters that are showing the voltage and signal for the 150 ohm, the 1.2K, and the 10K settings on the Mic Pre. All right, let's give this a run and see what we can find out. We'll start with the 150 ohm. Okay, right away we can see that the electrons are moving fast, which means that there's a high amperage, and we're feeding 10 volts from the mic into the Mic Pre. And if we look at the voltage down here on the bottom, we can see that we're only getting 5 volts, which means that we're losing half the power from our mic just by matching the impedances. Okay, let's go and take a look at the 1.2K now. Okay, the electrons are moving a little bit slower this time, which means there's a lower amperage. And if we look at our meter down here, we can see that we're getting 8.889 volts, which is significantly higher than what we got at the lower impedance setting. Notice the inverse relationship between the amperage and the voltage. As the amperage goes down, the voltage goes up and vice versa. All right, let's look at the 10K. And we could see that the electrons are moving even slower. And if we go down to our meter, we can see that the voltage is now up to 9.852 volts. This is the strongest signal that we've seen at the Mic Pre so far, and it's no coincidence that it's also the highest impedance setting. While this is a nice simulation to show us what happens in theory, let's take a look at what happens in reality when we change the impedance of a dynamic microphone going into a Mic Pre.
Dynamic mics don't tend to have a single output impedance, however. The impedance can change depending on the frequency that it's capturing. AEA has a great little chart that shows impedance over the frequency spectrum for one of their mics. This same principle applies to just about every dynamic mic out there, but may not plot out exactly the same. So what happens when you don't follow the rule of thumb? The general consensus is that a few things will happen. First, the signal strength might be lower than you expect, causing you to have to turn the gain up higher than you would think, which can add noise to the recording. We saw this in the simulation. Second, the treble end of the spectrum may start to roll off as the lack of impedance causes the mic to dampen. The bottom end can also roll off, which causes an inaccurate representation of what you're trying to capture, leaving you with dull, mid-rangey sounding recordings. Now, these are the claims of what happens by some manufacturers. We saw that the signal strength claim seems to hold water in a simulation, but we're going to test whether or not those claims are true in the studio. But first, let's figure out what we're talking about here. Let's assume the marketing department isn't lying to us. I know it's a stretch, bear with me on this. We know that we have a mic impedance and a pre-impedance. How do we find out what these are? RTFM, or read the manual. Most, if not all, manufacturers will provide a spec sheet with the product you buy. It's not just for show, and it's not a scary thing to look at if you know what you're looking at. Let's take a few minutes to learn how to read one of these so when we plunk our hard-earned cash down on something, we're not just going off of what some anonymous internet denizen tells us sounds cool. We're going to use the Royer 121 spec sheet as an example because it's one of the mics we're going to feature in our examples, and it's one of my favorite ribbon mics. Sorry for the bias here, but it kicks ass.
So here's what we have. First, it tells us what kind of mic it is in technobabble. It's a dynamic ribbon mic. Second is the polar pattern of the mic, and we're going to come back to this later. Third, for a ribbon mic, this is the thickness of the actual ribbon. You won't see this on a moving coil mic spec sheet usually. Fourth, what type of magnets are used? Not all manufacturers disclose this, and quite frankly, it really doesn't matter, except we know that neodymium magnets tend to be orders of magnitude stronger than ferrous magnets. Fifth is the frequency response. This is the range that the mic can effectively pick up in hertz. Sixth, we have sensitivity. This is essentially the efficiency of the mic, or the ability of the mic to turn moving air into an electrical signal. The higher the number, the less gain you need to make the signal usable. Number 7 is fun time, the output impedance. This is what we're talking about. This gives us an ohm rating, but at a frequency. Usually we'll see it at 1K. Remember before we said that the impedance can change depending on what the frequency it's being fed? Yeah, that's this. We're only being shown what the impedance is rated at 1 kilohertz. We can refer back to the AEA chart to see what it might look like if manufacturers included such a chart with their specs. I, for one, would rather see that than this useless piece of information. Next up is the rated load impedance. All this is the impedance that was used to do the testing on the mic to get these numbers. Next is the maximum SPL, and this is telling us at what level we're going to mess this mic up and possibly damage it at what frequency. Notice again, like the output impedance, we're given a frequency. 20 Hz at 135 dB is going to shake that ribbon something fierce. The physical movement of the ribbon at that level can cause the ribbon to tear. This mic may very well handle more SPL at higher frequencies, but let's face it, we're probably not going to use a ribbon mic for applications where the SPL is going to get that high. Next, we have the output connector, XLR 3-pin, as opposed to, I don't know. Some vintage mics may have a Tuchel connector, which is also a 3-pin connection, but it's not an XLR connector. Usually you have to have some kind of a dongle to convert the Tuchel connector to an XLR. Some tube mics and dual diaphragm mics may have a 5 or 7-pin connector as well, so I guess that could be applicable. Some high impedance mics may also have an unbalanced connection, which you might see as a 1/4-inch TS connector, or if it's one of those really cheesy karaoke mics, you might even see an 1/8-inch TS connector as well. The rest of the information here has nothing to do with the performance of the mic and is either aesthetic or specific to the mic package. For example, if a cable or a case is included, or a fun sticker. Don't we all love stickers? Anyway, in this case, we're told that should the mic's ribbon fail or we rip it to shreds, Royer will replace the ribbon at no cost to the original owner within the first year. Royer's an awesome company, and their customer support is top-notch in my experience. I did wind up having an issue with my 121 after the warranty was expired, and they were amazing at taking care of the situation. So continuing down below, we see some more information that looks like some high school math homework from when you learned about graphing. And guess what? It is. That stuff you learned and forgot about in high school has actually become applicable. Mrs. Accardi would be proud. On the left, we have the frequency response. This shows what the output level of a given frequency is for the mic running into a 1500 ohm supposedly flat mic pre. We can tell that there's going to be a roll-off around 40 hertz down. There's an ever so slight wide scoop between 30 and 2K, a little bump up between 2K and 10K, and a slight roll-off above 10K. And then at the end, we have this little weird uptick around 17K or so. If we look at the scale on the left, we can see that these scoops, bumps, and dips are all less than 5 dB. If I had to guess, I'd probably say it's only within a couple of dB across the board. Even without picking up the mic, based upon this information, we can say that the mic should sound pretty smooth. With the exception of the extreme ends, there is no sharp upticks or drops in the response. Let's compare this to, say, an MXL 440 mic. This looks a little bit bumpy in the bottom end, and the mid-range is pretty tame until 3K, where it begins to lift off to the moon, reaching a crazy 8 dB increase around 12K. This mic is going to sound bright. And how about an SM57, the other mic that we're going to be using to test today? And thanks for the high-quality image, Shure. Yeah, this is from the Shure website, actually. We can certainly glean a lot from this tech document, but we can clearly see that this mic is an absolute mess as far as frequency response goes. Yet, it's one of the most used mics in the industry. It has a sound, and for certain things, we like that sound. We don't need a mic to have a flat response for it to sound good. We just need to match it to our expectations for what we're using it for. That MXL mic might sound great with a really dark mic preamp like a Day King or a Joe Meek, or some source that tends to be lacking high end, or in a situation where we want to really accentuate the high end, like 8 dB accentuate. Yeah. The right-hand side shows us how the mic picks up around the circumference of the mic. Notice the sides pretty much pick up nothing, which is a feature of a figure 8 polar pattern and most ribbon mics. This allows us to point that part of the mic to something we don't want to capture. It's handy when recording an acoustic guitarist that's singing. Point the null area towards the voice and you get less bleed.
Mic pre's and interfaces have similar information. Here's a quick chart of input impedances for some commonly found devices in pro and home studios. We reached out to UA to see what the range of the input impedance is on their Apollo X mic pre's, but their answer was a little dodgy. Essentially, there's a default of 5.4K at the mic input, and their Unison plugins can change that impedance to match the model of the pre that's being emulated. Which is really awesome and will certainly help with authenticity, right? We'll see. So if a higher impedance is better for mics, why doesn't every mic pre just use some crazy value like the AEA TRP2 coming in at 63,000 ohms? Well, people love their classic and vintage designs, and impedance is a characteristic of the input transformer if there is one. In addition, some mics don't always sound better with a higher input impedance. Prior to doing this video, I always thought that our U87 clone and most of our condenser mics for that matter sounded better at a lower impedance setting at the pre. Admittedly, I'd never thought about why until now, and after digging deep into this topic, my thoughts may have changed. So, most modern designs find a happy middle, like the Scarlett and Volt interfaces, which come in at 3K. Now for the thing that everybody actually cares about. What do these differences sound like? We're going to take our Royer 121 ribbon mic, an SM57, and our U87 clone and put them in front of a reamped guitar and bass cabinet and run it through a little device from Cloud called the CLZ. This device will allow us to change the impedance the mic sees from 15 kiloohms all the way down to 150 ohms. Since we can leave the mic presettings the same, this test should be very consistent. The condenser mic we can't run through the CLZ, so we'll use a different pre that has a big swing between impedance settings for an example. We're mainly looking for what the impedance settings changes in relation to the mic, and not really what the sound of the pre is imparting on the signal. So for the dynamics, the only thing changing is the impedance between the mic and the CLZ. For the condenser, it's the same, however, there are only two settings. See if you can hear the difference. Let's get to it. Okay, you thought we were done, but no. After doing this test, we came up with the results you saw on the screen at each step and decided to dive down this rabbit hole even further. Here's where I started getting all tinfoil hat with the marketing departments of various manufacturers. We saw that the dynamic mic's levels benefited from a higher impedance somewhere in between 150 ohms and 3K. The differences between 3K and 15K were less than 1 dBFS and low enough that I would say aren't all that significant from a level perspective. Absolutely a difference between 150 and 3K though. The signal difference will definitely help keep the noise floor down for most applications. When it comes to condenser mics, however, we were seeing the exact opposite phenomena. So what's going on here? Did Ohm's law all of a sudden change? The lower the impedance, the higher signal we were getting out of the pre. So what's the deal with that? Well, I'll be honest, at first I was really confused by this. I thought maybe it had to do with the mic being active, maybe the head amp in the mic, and a whole bunch of other things. So with those theories in mind, I really wanted to find out what was going on. Well, it turns out when you change the impedance on some mic pre's, you're also changing the windings on the input transformer. In our dynamic experiment, the only thing that we were changing was the impedance and not the coils on the mic pre, so we were getting an actual reading of what just the impedance does in relation to the mic. With the condenser, we were not only changing the impedance, but also changing the coil taps on the transformer. Even though we were gaining signal level by increasing the impedance, we were losing more level by changing the ratio of the transformer. So to double check, we used a small esoteric battery-powered condenser mic, this Shure 16A. When we tested again off camera, we found the exact same behavior as the dynamic mics. And obviously I'm not recording this video in real time, and I could have hidden that aspect of the experiment if I wanted to, but it serves to prove a point. Understanding how your gear works is key to getting the results that you want. So tonight I can finally get some sleep, because this thing has been bugging me for about a week now. So far, our experiments have mirrored the simulation, which confirms the idea that increased impedance allows for better voltage transfer between the mic and the pre-input. Great. So let's look at some of the other claims that manufacturers make. Knowing what I know now from this first set of experiments, I now have my doubts about the veracity of the rest of the claims. Multiple manufacturers claim that increased impedance affects the sharpness of the transient. The claim is that lower impedances smear or flatten the transient. This is a really easy one to check out, so to do so, we popped our 121 in front of our studio monitors and recorded the playback of a snare hit. First we set the impedance to 150 ohms, and then we set the impedance to 15K. While I see some subtle differences in the recovery from the transient, I certainly don't see the transient's sharpness being affected in any way. I also tested this theory with a square wave through the speaker, which will obviously never look like a square wave once we re-record it, but the thought is that the playback of the blip is going to be as sharp as we can expect a reproduced signal to be. Again, nothing of significance can be seen here, and I'm going to have to call BS on these claims. If we didn't match the gain between the two tests, certainly the lower impedance will start to sound much more dull and low because it actually is. We're looking at a 12 dB gain difference in some of our tests here, so while the amplitude is lower, the transient certainly is not different enough to make a claim that the higher impedance makes transient sharper. Louder? Yes. Sharper? Absolutely not. The last claim that we're going to look at today is the difference in impedance being a tone shaper. It's said that at higher impedance, the low and high end are better represented, which makes the mic sound more open or true. To test this, we put our mic in front of our studio monitors again and ran a 20 to 20K frequency sweep at 150 ohms and 15K ohms. In reality, we checked all of the marked settings on the CLZ as we did with the other tests. But between the 150 ohm and 15K ohm settings, we had a significant change in the low end, around 8 dBFS in some spots. The high end showed no considerable change, so I'm going to say based on this information that there is some credibility to the claims in the lower end of the spectrum, but the higher end is not significant enough to care about. My thoughts on this are that there's a very slight high-pass filter being created between the capacitance in the cable or full signal chain and the pre-impedance. To see a very slow drop of about 8 dB from 600 Hz down doesn't lead me to believe that the change in impedance is doing anything to the mic itself, but more to the signal flowing through the full chain. I could potentially test this to see if that changes with shorter cable runs, but I'll leave that up to you if you feel there's any knowledge to be gained there. I personally don't find it significant enough, being how shallow of a roll-off the lower impedance exhibited. It certainly could be compensated for in the mix, and it's not like the impedance changes causing the frequency response to be wildly different. The difference between closer settings like 300 and 1200 from our 1073 was only about a dB or so in full scale the same way. So are things like the CLZ, the Cloud Lifter, or high impedance ribbon mic preamps just smoke and mirrors? From a marketing standpoint, I think their claims are a little bit stretched, but from a practical standpoint, I'd actually say no. Even though the data seems to show that there's not a meaningful difference between the tone of the sound when compensated for gain, there's certainly something to be said about having a very clean, high-gain preamp available in the studio. If that was the only way that the products were marketed, I'd probably still own the CLZ, a Cloud Lifter, and my RPQ preamps. In really dynamically critical applications like classical or jazz recordings, having that noise floor be as low as possible is essential. Is the impedance the big thing that's making that happen? That's debatable, since in many cases changing the impedance also changes the ratio of the transformer, which may or may not allow for a few extra dB of headroom versus the noise floor. Is the 63 kiloohm input impedance making or breaking a recording? Absolutely not. Does the pre provide clean gain and an ideal voltage signal path? Yeah, so shut up and take my money. Is a high impedance path this important tone shaping tool that manufacturers claim? For me, no. For you, it might be significant enough to consider. I personally would just roll a slight shelf of EQ if needed to compensate for it and call it a day. If your recording is playing around too close to the noise floor on the bottom end, then maybe it becomes a worthwhile claim. So here's the bottom line. There's no set it and forget it, there's no magic bullet, and I can't encourage everyone enough to experiment with the equipment that they have and learn how their gear works alongside everything else that you use. Whether it's a single mic into a single interface pre or a pro studio with dozens of mic and preamp choices, learn your gear inside and out. No one can tell you what is right for every or any situation except for the person that's in that situation, and that person is you. Trust your ears. If it sounds right, then it is right. If you have doubts or questions, experiment and find the answers that you yourself can hear. If you have any questions or comments about this video, or if I screwed something up, please leave me a message in the comments. The last thing I want to do here is be spreading more false information. Please like and subscribe if you got anything from today's video so I can continue to bring you more videos every week or so. That's it for this time. This is Pags, signing off.